Number 6. William Henry Harrison, March 4th, 1841. The weather in Washington, D.C. is brutal. Freezing rain, bitter wind. Any sensible man would cut his remarks short, duck inside, and get warm. William Henry Harrison is not feeling sensible. He is feeling historic. Harrison has just won one of the most hard-fought elections in American history. He's 68 years old, the oldest man ever elected to the presidency at that point, and he has something to prove. His opponents have been mocking him for months. They called him Granny Harrison, said he was too old, too frail, too feeble to lead a nation. So Harrison decides to answer his critics the only way he knows how. He rides to the Capitol on horseback. No hat, no coat, no gloves. Then he delivers the longest inaugural address in American presidential history. 1 hour and 45 minutes. 8,445 words. Standing in the freezing rain, hatless, coatless, in front of thousands of people, reading a speech about how tough he is. By the end of the ceremony, Harrison is shivering. 3 days later, he has a cold. The cold becomes pneumonia. The pneumonia becomes pleurisy. And the man who spent 2 hours proving he wasn't old and weak is now bedridden in the White House, delirious with fever, while his doctors pour castor oil, opium, and crude petroleum down his throat as treatment. He dies on April 4th, 1841, exactly 31 days into his presidency, the shortest term in American history. The man who wanted to prove he was the toughest president who ever lived became the first one to die in office. His doctors tried everything available to them at the time, which, in 1841, meant a terrifying parade of treatments including laudanum, castor oil, opium tinctures, brandy, and something called Virginia snakeweed, a folk remedy his physician apparently grabbed out of desperation. Each treatment made him worse. His kidneys began to fail. He developed an intestinal infection on top of the pneumonia. In his final hours, he was delirious, muttering incoherently to what he seemed to think was his vice president. "Sir, I wish you to understand the true principles of the government. I ask nothing more," though no one was there. He died alone in a White House bedroom, surrounded by panicked aides and a cabinet that had known him for less than 5 weeks. The irony is almost too perfect. Harrison didn't die from an assassin's bullet or a political enemy's knife. He died proving he didn't need a coat. His political opponents had called him weak. He answered them with the most expensive 2 hours of public bravado in the history of the American presidency. Number 5. Warren G. Harding, August 2nd, 1923. San Francisco. President Warren Harding is recovering from what his doctors describe as food poisoning. He seems to be getting better. He's sitting up in bed. His wife Florence is reading to him. By all accounts, he's turning a corner. Then, without any warning, he goes completely still, dead at 57. No autopsy. Florence refuses to allow one. Here's why that matters. Warren G. Harding had one of the most spectacularly corrupt administrations in American history. The Teapot Dome scandal, bribery, oil deals, secret meetings. His presidency was already starting to unravel around him, and it would only get worse after his death. But here's the other thing about Harding that his official biography tends to gloss over. He was a prolific cheater, multiple mistresses, letters so explicit that the Library of Congress locked them away for decades. One mistress named Nan Britton claimed to have had his child and wrote a tell-all book about their affairs in the White House coat closet. Florence Harding knew all of it. She had hired private investigators to follow her husband. She had read the letters. She had sat quietly through years of humiliation while the entire country seemed to know what was happening except, officially, her. When Harding died, Florence refused an autopsy, refused an embalming examination, and had him buried as quickly as possible. She then spent the next year burning every document, letter, and personal paper she could find. Every single one. Was she covering up natural causes or something else? The official cause of death was a heart attack. But in 1930, a doctor named Gaston Means published a book called The Strange Death of President Harding, claiming Florence had poisoned him with a carefully administered dose that mimicked cardiac arrest. The book was sensationalist garbage. Means was a convicted fraudster who would later die in prison. But the question he raised has never been fully answered. Florence was a woman who had access, motive, means, and a documented pattern of destroying evidence. She had watched her husband humiliate her for years. She had read the letters. Because there was no autopsy, Florence made sure of that. She outlived her husband by less than a year and a half. She died in November 1924, taking everything she knew with her. The Teapot Dome scandal continued to unfold after her death, consuming the reputations of nearly everyone connected to Harding's administration. Several of his closest advisors faced criminal charges. His attorney general was indicted. His interior secretary went to prison. Warren G. Harding died surrounded by his doctors in a nice hotel room while his wife read to him. And to this day, nobody can say for absolute certain exactly what killed him. The absence of an autopsy isn't just suspicious. In a case this complicated, surrounded by this much motive and this much destroyed evidence, the absence of an autopsy is almost a statement in itself. Number 4. James Garfield, July 2nd, 1881. Washington, D.C. Union Station. President James Garfield is walking through the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Depot when a man named Charles Guiteau steps up behind him and fires 2 shots. The first grazes Garfield's arm. The second hits him in the back. Here's the thing about that second bullet. It misses every vital organ. It doesn't hit the spine. It doesn't puncture the lungs. It lodges harmlessly in the muscle tissue near his pancreas. Modern medicine would have left it there, let it scar over, and Garfield would have been back at his desk in 6 weeks. Instead, what happens next is one of the most catastrophic medical disasters in American history. Garfield's doctors, led by a physician named Dr. Willard Bliss. Yes, his name was actually Dr. Bliss, which is almost offensively ironic. Descend on the wound with absolute confidence and absolutely filthy hands. This is 1881. Joseph Lister had already published his germ theory of infection. Antiseptic medicine existed. Doctors in Europe were scrubbing their hands and sterilizing their tools. But American medicine was behind, and Dr. Bliss was skeptical of the whole germ business. He and his colleagues probed the wound with unwashed fingers, unsterilized metal instruments, anything they could find, over and over, for weeks on end. What had been a 3-inch wound became a 20-inch infected channel carved through Garfield's body. The infection that followed was catastrophic. Garfield's weight dropped from 210 pounds to 130. He vomited constantly. He burned with fever. He screamed in pain. The White House, in the August heat, became a humid hell, and Alexander Graham Bell, yes, that Alexander Graham Bell, actually showed up with an early metal detector he'd invented, trying to find the bullet so doctors could remove it. The detector kept going off in the wrong place because Garfield was lying on a metal spring mattress. Nobody thought to move him. Guiteau, the man who shot him, watched the whole spectacle from jail and told anyone who'd listen, "I just shot him. The doctors killed him." He wasn't entirely wrong. Garfield died on September 19th, 80 days after the shooting. Guiteau was convicted of murder, and at his trial, his defense argued that the doctor's malpractice had actually caused the death. The judge rejected it, but the argument wasn't crazy. 1 bullet. 80 days. Death by the men sworn to save him. Number 3. Abraham Lincoln, April 14th, 1865. Ford's Theater, Washington, D.C. The Civil War is effectively over. Lee surrendered to Grant 5 days ago. The nation is exhausted, broken, and just beginning to imagine something like healing. Lincoln is in the best mood anyone around him has seen in years. He almost doesn't go. Lincoln had been complaining of bad dreams. He'd told his cabinet that morning about a recurring nightmare, a ship sailing fast toward a dark shore. He didn't know what it meant, but it unsettled him. Mary Todd was unwell. Lincoln had stacks of paperwork and a nation to rebuild. Every reason to stay in the White House existed, but the theater had advertised his attendance. If he didn't show up, it would look bad. So he went. John Wilkes Booth had been planning this for months. Not just Lincoln. Booth's network of conspirators planned to assassinate the vice president and the secretary of state simultaneously. A coordinated decapitation of the entire executive branch in a single night. It very nearly worked. Booth knew Ford's Theater intimately. He performed there. He knew the layout, the backstage access, the exact sightlines from the presidential box. He knew the single bodyguard assigned to Lincoln that night, a man named John Parker, had a habit of abandoning his post. Parker left his chair outside Lincoln's box to go watch the play from a better seat. Then he went to the tavern next door. At 10:15 p.m., Booth walked through an unguarded door, crossed the empty hallway, put a single-shot Derringer against the back of Lincoln's head, and fired. Lincoln never regained consciousness. He was carried across the street to a boarding house. They didn't think he'd survive a carriage ride back to the White House, and laid diagonally across a bed that was too small for his 6 feet 4 inches frame. 9 doctors attended him through the night. There was nothing to be done. The bullet had entered behind his left ear and lodged behind his right eye socket. The damage was catastrophic and irreversible from the moment Booth pulled the trigger. The doctors did what they could, which was essentially to keep the wound draining and keep him breathing. Mary Todd Lincoln sat in a waiting room down the hall, unable to stay in the room, her screaming, according to witnesses, was unbearable. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton managed the crisis from a chair at the bedside, issuing orders, coordinating the manhunt for Booth, and essentially running the government through the night while the president lay dying 8 feet away. He died at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th. Stanton stood at the bedside and said, "Now he belongs to the ages." The bodyguard, John Parker, was never charged. He returned to the D.C. police force and continued his career for 3 more years. He was eventually dismissed in 1868, not for abandoning Lincoln, but for sleeping on duty. His personnel file exists in the National Archives. The words, Ford's Theater, do not appear in it. Number 2. John F. Kennedy, November 22, 1963. Dallas, Texas. Dealey Plaza. President John F. Kennedy is riding in an open-top Lincoln Continental through cheering crowds. The sun is out. Jackie is wearing pink. Kennedy is waving. Everything is fine. Then it isn't. 3 shots. 12 seconds. And the most powerful country on earth spends the next 60 years arguing about what actually happened. Here's what we know. The Warren Commission, the official government investigation, concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, firing from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. 1 shooter, 3 shots. Case closed. Except the case has never felt closed to anyone. Not really. Start with the security failures. Kennedy's motorcade route had been published in Dallas newspapers 2 days before the trip. The route ran directly past the book depository, a building full of unsecured windows and open stairwells. The Secret Service had received specific warnings about Dallas. The city had a volatile political climate, and Kennedy's team knew it. Adlai Stevenson had been physically attacked there just weeks earlier. Multiple advisors urged Kennedy not to go. He went anyway. The open-top car. That detail alone has driven historians to distraction for decades. The bubble-top protective cover existed. It wasn't bulletproof, but it would have obstructed the sightlines. The Secret Service chose not to use it because the weather was nice and Kennedy liked to be visible to crowds. Nice weather. That was the call. Oswald himself never made it to trial. 2 days after the assassination, while being transferred through the Dallas Police Department basement, a transfer that was announced to the press and carried live on national television, a nightclub owner named Jack Ruby walked through the crowd and shot Oswald in the stomach at point-blank range, on live TV, in front of dozens of police officers. Ruby died in prison of cancer in 1967, before his second trial could begin. He told investigators he acted alone, out of grief for Kennedy and concern for Jackie. He told other people other things at other times. His story shifted. His health declined. He died insisting he hadn't told the full truth and that he never would be allowed to. The House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1979 reviewed the evidence again and concluded, contrary to the Warren Commission, that Kennedy was probably killed as the result of a conspiracy. They cited acoustic evidence suggesting 4 shots, not 3. The scientific community disputed the acoustic findings. The argument continues. What makes Kennedy's death land on this list isn't just the assassination itself, it's the totality of the failure surrounding it. The published route, the open car, the unsecured building, the transfer announcement, the live television shooting of the only suspect. Every layer of protection failed in sequence, like dominoes, in broad daylight, in front of the entire world. And then, because this story apparently wasn't surreal enough, the medical evidence got contaminated almost immediately. Kennedy's body was removed from Dallas before a Texas state autopsy could be performed, over the explicit objections of the local medical examiner. The autopsy that did happen, at Bethesda Naval Hospital, was conducted by military doctors with limited forensic experience, under chaotic conditions, with senior military officials present in the autopsy room. Notes were destroyed, photos were disputed, chain of custody for evidence was broken in multiple places. 60-plus years later, thousands of pages of CIA and FBI documents related to the assassination are still classified. The National Archives continues to release batches under court order. The most recent releases in 2023 answered some questions and raised new ones. Kennedy was 46 years old. He had been president for just under 3 years. Whatever you believe about who pulled the trigger and why, the machinery that was supposed to protect him failed completely, publicly, and permanently. No accountability followed. No one was ever convicted of the assassination. The man charged was shot dead on live television before he could speak in court. That's not just a bad death. That's the kind of death that rewires a country's relationship with its own government. Americans in 1963 trusted their institutions. The polls show it clearly. In the decades after Dallas, That trust never fully came back. One open-top car, one published route, one unsecured window. That's all it took. Number 1. William McKinley, September 6, 1901, Buffalo, New York. The Pan American Exposition. President William McKinley is doing what he loves most, shaking hands with the public. He insisted on it. His security detail begged him to cancel the open reception. The crowd was massive, unscreened, pressing forward in a line that stretched out the doors of the Temple of Music. McKinley waved off their concerns. "No one would want to hurt me," he said. Leon Czolgosz had been waiting in that line for 20 minutes. He had wrapped his right hand in a bandage to conceal the revolver underneath. When he reached the front, McKinley extended his hand to shake. Czolgosz knocked it aside and fired twice through the bandage. The first bullet was deflected by a button. The second hit McKinley in the stomach and lodged somewhere behind his pancreas. Surgeons operated that evening. They couldn't find the second bullet. They sewed him up. The wound seemed clean. McKinley woke up and told the men around him he felt fine. He asked whether his wife had been told gently. He seemed, against all odds, to be recovering. For 8 days, the country exhaled. Then gangrene set in. Quietly, invisibly, spreading along the bullet's path. By September 13th, McKinley was slipping. He held his wife's hand and murmured the words of his favorite hymn, "Nearer, my God, to thee." He died on September 14th. Theodore Roosevelt, who had been on a wilderness hiking trip when the assassination happened and returned only when he got word that McKinley was critical, was sworn in as president that afternoon. At 42, he became the youngest president in American history. McKinley's death carries one detail that makes it almost unbearable in retrospect. At the exposition where he was shot, there was a new invention on display in one of the exhibition halls, a medical device. Something that had never been used in a presidential assassination before, an X-ray machine. It was 40 feet away from where McKinley lay dying, in a building at the same fairground, on the same day. His doctors chose not to use it. They weren't sure they trusted the technology. One senior physician reportedly dismissed the suggestion, saying they didn't want to experiment on the President of the United States with an unproven device. So they stitched him up, monitored him for a week, told the country he was recovering, and watched him die from an infection they never located because they never found the bullet. Czolgosz, the assassin, was convicted, executed by electric chair on October 29, 1901, 45 days after McKinley died. His body was dissolved in acid at the prison's request to prevent his grave from becoming a memorial. That's not just a bad death. That's a tragedy with a punchline. The kind of thing you couldn't write without someone accusing you of exaggerating. History didn't exaggerate. History rarely needs to.